Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Research Across Canada webinar. I'm Jennifer Conley, Vice President of Philanthropy at MS Canada. Before we begin, we wish to ensure that you have the best experience. To choose the language you would like to listen to, click on the interpretation button in the navigation bar at the bottom of your screen and select the language that you wish to listen to. If you're listening in French, please select Mute Original Audio. We are so thrilled to have so many of you join us for what will be, without a doubt, an informative and inspirational discussion. Today, we have the opportunity to hear directly from MS researchers whose groundbreaking work is driving forward our understanding and our knowledge about MS. At MS Canada, we propel this momentum in MS research by investing in the promising work in support of our impact goals. Our impact goals are the change we want to achieve in MS, to advance treatment and care, to enhance well-being, to understand and halt disease progression, and ultimately to prevent MS before it starts. Real change happens when we're all united in our vision of a world free of MS. It's through the collective action of many individuals like yourselves that has resulted in the tremendous progress we've seen in MS to date. You are our champions and ambassadors, and we are so grateful for you. Now, let's hear about some of the exciting work being undertaken straight from our research panel. And if this conversation inspires a question for you, please type the question in the Q&A chat. We'll take questions at the end as time allows. So I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Originally, Dr. Pamela Valentine, our President and CEO of MS Canada, was scheduled to join us, but she's unable to be here. However, we are very pleased, there he is, very pleased to have Benjamin Davis, MS Canada's Senior Vice President of Mission, to be our moderator today. Please join me in warmly welcoming Ben. Hi, Ben. Thank you.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're delighted to have you all join today's panel discussion as we learn about some of the incredible progress happening in MS research. Research is embedded in MS Canada's strategic framework of Discover, Innovate, Act. And together with the impact goals Jennifer just mentioned, we have a blueprint for a clear path towards building a world free of MS. We're fortunate as Canada is home to a world-class research enterprise made up of internationally recognized MS researchers, including today's panelists. In today's discussion, you'll hear about the potential of reversing damage caused by MS and restoring neurological functions by promoting myelin production through the use of a novel molecule. You'll also learn about research that aims to understand factors that influence the risk of developing MS and how viruses, specifically the Epstein-Barr virus, leads to MS onset, and hear about the development of prevention strategies. The research we'll be discussing will impact a person living with MS today and can change the face of MS tomorrow. And that's not a statement based on hope. It's based on where the science is leading us. And right now, we have the privilege of hearing and learning directly from some of Canada's most prominent MS researchers working in the field. So let's meet our esteemed panelists. First, please welcome Dr. Marc Horwitz. Dr. Horwitz is a professor in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology and Sauder Chair of Pediatric Virology at the University of British Columbia. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Horwitz. Can you give us all a brief description of your area of research focus?
Yeah, happy to be here. Our focus is on trying to understand how viruses affect autoimmune disease. And for the past few years, many years now, where our focus has really been on Epstein-Barr virus and multiple sclerosis, and just modeling, trying to figure out the mechanism of action.
Wonderful. Thank you. We look forward to learning more today. Also joining us is Dr. Anastassia Voronova. Dr. Voronova is an associate professor in the Department of Medical Genetics at the University of Alberta and a Canada Research Chair in Neural Stem Cell Biology. Dr. Voronova, welcome. Could you also give us a brief overview of your area of focus?
Thanks very much for having me here. So our research program is really geared towards development of remyelination therapies, and we do so by focusing on the stem cells that we already have in our adult brain. Now, unfortunately, I call them lazy or sleepy. They're supposed to replace damaged or lost cells, but unfortunately, they're just reluctant to do so, especially in people with MS. And so my research program aims to understand how to pharmacologically engage or wake them up to really promote myelin regeneration.
Thank you, Dr. Voronova. Looking forward to hearing more. And next, I'll introduce you to Dr. Ruth Marrie. Dr. Marrie is a professor of medicine at Dalhousie University. She currently holds the Multiple Sclerosis Clinical Research Chair and serves as the Vice Chair of the Scientific Steering Committee for the International Progressive MS Alliance. Dr. Marrie, please share with our guests your specific area of research, please.
Thanks for having me today and giving me the chance to talk about this. So I have a couple of areas that I focus on. One is really trying to understand how coexisting health conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure affect outcomes in people with multiple sclerosis, with the goal of ultimately, hopefully, reducing progression related to those conditions. And the other is trying to really focus on learning about how we can identify people with MS before they have their first typical attack, but maybe in a stage that we think about as a prodrome. So when people have non-specific kind of warning symptoms, perhaps, to see if we could maybe prevent the disease from really going on to what we currently recognize as MS.
Thank you. And thank you all for giving us a brief overview of your areas of research. I hope it certainly helped. I think it has absolutely helped give our guests some context for our discussion today. Funding world-class research is fundamental to changing the lives of people affected by MS. When we invest in research that is aligned with the impact goals, it ensures the greatest impact for people affected by this disease. Because of community and donor support, the MS research community has made exceptional strides towards these impact goals, specifically in advancing treatment and care. In recent years, there has been vastly improved interventions and treatments, which are resulting in decreased mortality rates and significant delays in disability. This is progress that wasn't possible just a few decades ago, and it drives us to ask, what else is possible? What if we could halt and even reverse the damage and regain functionality? So, Dr. Marrie, in your experience as a neurologist, can you comment on the current treatment landscape for MS? What have we achieved to date, and what do you see as the greatest unmet need in the field?
Thanks. So, when I started my medical training, we didn't have any therapies that were specific to multiple sclerosis to tackle relapses, disability progression in any way. And so when I look now at the landscape where we've gone from nothing to multiple therapies where people have choices about the therapy they take, things with differing routes of administration and different tiers of effectiveness, things that you can take when you are pregnant or breastfeeding. These are all choices we didn't used to have. So I think that's been a great advance, and there are many people who have lives now where they can go on therapy and may not have further relapses or have far fewer and less severe ones. However, although we've made all of that progress, we know that we're still dealing with a problem around progression of disability. So people are still worsening in terms of their physical function, or cognitive function, and that interferes with living the life that people want to live. And so that I see that sort of aspect of disease progression and progressive MS as being our largest unmet need. And I think that's a recognition shared by the global MS community.
Thank you, Dr. Marrie. Dr. Voronova, with your work on brain repair and regeneration, Can you help us define the concept of myelin repair and regeneration? And why are these processes important in MS?
Thank you. So I'll piggyback off of Dr. Marie's answer and really dive into the prevention of disability progression. And that's the keystone with myelin regeneration. So myelin is sort of this fatty substance that we have in the brain that coats the nerves. And so it speeds the signal propagation so we can think fast, act fast, but it also protects these nerves from insults by the environment. And so when that myelin or the fatty substance is gone, these nerves are vulnerable. And so they become damaged and sometimes they're lost. Depending on what nerves are lost and what brain area, people with MS may have different neurological symptoms. So if we can find a way how to replace that lost myelin, then we can halt the disease progression or maybe even reverse some of the neurological symptoms. And I think that provides maybe perhaps a bit of a anatomical or a cellular context to why the global MS community is pivoting towards myelin regeneration, or as we call it, remyelination therapies to halt the disease progression.
Thank you. As a follow-up question to you, Dr. Voronova, for a number of years, MS Canada has supported your work on a brain molecule called fractalkine. Can you share more about this research and the progress you've made to date?
Absolutely. So it's a bit of a mouthful. All it is that it's a molecule that is found abundantly in the brain. So it's a naturally occurring molecule. And so how we landed on this is we studied how cells communicate with each other in the brain. So you and I are both communicating with each other right now. We don't exist in isolation. So these stem cells that are referred to also don't exist in isolation. They communicate with these other cell types in the brain. And so we intercepted, so to speak, this chemical messenger that a particular type of cell communicates to the neural stem cells to make this myelin-producing cell. And so MS Canada was the first funding organization that really believed in our vision that we could use this molecule to promote remyelination. So we've done so in preclinical rodent models. And now we're actually spearheading a drug discovery and development program as a result of that, to mimic fractalkine's action. And so far we've screened hundreds of molecules, and so we've landed on something that is very potent, and so we're trying to make it cross the blood-brain barrier to reach the brain, and we hope that it'll be a springboard, so to speak, to then launch the development and optimization of that lead molecule, and that wouldn't have been possible without that original investment by MS Canada.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I tried pronouncing that word all day, but as usual.
All right. Maybe by the end of this webinar, you'll get it.
There's always hope. Yes, thank you. One more question for you. So more recently, you were also funded a MS Canada Catalyst grant in which you were collaborating with Dr. Horwitz. Can you talk a little bit about this research and what it hopes to achieve?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just take a step back a little bit, but connect the themes nevertheless. Because we're now in the drug development business, I had to make a 10-year plan of what our clinical trial could be and how we would approach that. And at that time, I realized, and my team realized, that actually there's a lot of disease modifiers in MS. And part of that is our genetic code. So we all have these, so to speak, typos in our DNA that may be completely benign or harmless, or they may actually influence how our disease may progress. So some people will be more protected from disability progression, or some people may accelerate much faster. And so when we're designing these clinical trials, I think it's important to keep that in mind. How we're going to define responders and non-responders who will be included and excluded in clinical trials so that we can serve the best population with that particular drug. And at that point, of course, genetics started to populate my brain and how this is so important. And I reached out to Dr. Horwitz because I said, hey, genetics and environment always interact. And it just sort of sparked my mind how we don't really understand this in the context of MS. We have all heard about Epstein-Barr virus and how this is so important in the development of MS. But we don't really know how it's important for every individual person, and that is influenced by the genetics. And so we decided to put our minds together and really investigate how the personal genetics and the EBV infection may come together for the development of multiple sclerosis and or the progression of MS.
Thank you. And that's a great way to segue into our next element of our discussion. So thank you. It wasn't long ago that we didn't understand the role of the Epstein-Barr virus as an early trigger for the onset of MS. And now it's emerging as an instrumental piece of the prevention puzzle. A few years ago, we didn't even use the word prevention. It felt like a far-reaching target that we hoped to reach one day. But with recent discoveries, like the EBV connection, preventing MS is closer than we ever imagined. So Dr. Horwitz, would you share a bit of what we currently know about the Epstein-Barr virus and the role we think it plays in MS? And you seem to be muted. Yes, thank you.
There we go. Okay, so yeah, Epstein-Barr virus is a virus that the majority of us are infected with by the time we're 20. It's a virus that's very much like chickenpox or herpes simplex, that you get it and you have an acute infection and you recover, but then the virus stays with you for the remainder of your life. And this is a key component. It's not like other viruses like influenza or maybe even COVID, some people would say, where you get infected and the virus is gone. So the virus has created a situation where it has agreed to a détente with our immune system. So it's going to sacrifice some of its lifestyle, and our immune system is going to sacrifice as well. And that's how we're going to go forward and live together. And so there's a lot of viruses in our body that this actually happens to, and this is just what EBV does. And with EBV, if you get it in your infection later in your teens or early 20s, you get infectious mononucleosis associated with it, which is quite a different disease than if you get it when you're like 3 or 4 years old. And so the infectious mono is also associated with MS, not at the nearly 100% level that the virus is, but taken that 95% of us have and carry EBV in a small number of B cells out of our immune system in our body. This is enough to associate to the getting MS, and what it's 1 in 400 Canadians. So when you go and you think about all those numbers, what is going on? And what we did was we looked at a mouse model of this virus, very similar virus. And what we found is that the virus itself, it's the détente that's causing all the issues. So its mere presence is causing the immune system to overreact to the next environmental event that happens, whether it's a virus infection, whether it's a targeted vaccination approach, or in our case in mice, where we try to induce a disease called EAE, which is a mouse model of MS. And what we see is it no longer looks like EAE, it looks like MS. And the reason is the immune system is responding as if the virus has reactivated and it wants to attack it. And so as you remember from seeing yourself or other people get shingles after chickenpox or a herpes lesion after later in life, this is highly inflamed and is a lesion on your body. And in the case of MS, some environmental factor is actually targeting the brain and the oligodendrocytes. And that part we don't really know. We have lots of indications what might be going on. So that's the current thought, at least from our group, that it's a passive approach. There could be other things, like you may hear about molecular mimicry, activation of T cells, all these. That's all part of it, but really the virus induction of it is pretty passive. It's really the immune system that's changed. And that's why it works so well with looking at Anastassia's work, is that we can set up a mouse that has this infection and then look at the changes that happen in the brain, because those are the mice, if we're studying any disease, we should be studying, because the link to people is 95% of us have it. So we need our mice to have that virus to see what this overreaction is all about.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Thank you. And a follow-up question, of which you might have touched upon a bit of this, but I'll give you the opportunity to perhaps expand. MS Canada, in partnership with the National MS Society in the United States, has been supporting your research focused on understanding EBV and MS. Can you talk about what you have learned so far as it pertains to that specific EBV research? I know you
Yeah,
just done a piece of that, but is there elements
yeah,
that
yeah.
you can share?
Basically, we set up two small grants that you and NMS Canada have supported, and they took two directions. And one was, so in our mouse model, can we get rid of the virus, and what would that take? So part of it was a little vaccine approach, with which people are trying to do with EBV anyways, but we're trying to figure out if this would feasibly change the overreaction and induction of disease. And so our preliminary data shows that using a very crude vaccine, that we are able to stop the enhancement of disease by using a vaccine. How long it lasts, how much time between vaccine and induction disease, we don't really know yet. We haven't been able to do that. That's going to take a couple more years. The other thing we've tried is using CAR T cells. CAR T cells are an approach where you take an antibody that's specific to something, and then you add a T cell to it, and it goes and it finds that something, and then it basically kills it. And these are much stronger than monoclonal antibody therapies that we currently have. And so we're asking, if we want to remove B cells, which are the host, does that stop the enhancement? And so far, the answer is yes. And then we have a couple other approaches we're trying, which are one's called kick and kill, which has been taken from EBV's cancer research. And it's basically the idea that you can reactivate the virus, which isn't typically seen. The virus is usually sleeping. You reactivate it. Now it's active. Our immune system can attack it, as well as we can add things to attack it, like CAR T cells, antibodies, drugs. And so that's in the process. The other grant we have is to take human immune systems from PBMC samples, blood samples from patients, and put them into mice. And we find that they not only bring the human immune systems, they bring Epstein-Barr virus. And so we want to know how that's functioning to change disease, because all our preliminary work has all been with this other rodent virus. So let's find out what EBV does. And we know that in this case that EBV is actually doing the same thing that the other virus did. It's activating and causing overreaction. And now we're kind of playing with the system to make sure that we have better samples of an immune system with more B cells in it, and super infecting with EBV. Just a little polishing up, but trying to make this a better model in general.
Incredible. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting. Kick and kill. I hadn't heard that term before. The research you just talked about is a great example of the type of global collaboration that is needed when it comes to supporting promising research in MS. We know that through consolidated effort, we can reach impactful outcomes quicker and more efficiently. Recently, we partnered with MS organizations around the world to take part in the first ever global assessment of MS research, and discovered that only 6% of all MS research funding goes towards targeting MS prevention. This landscape analysis identified this as a significant gap, and the global MS community has come together to address this through an agreed roadmap of research priorities. Those priorities include accelerating discoveries and repairing and restoring lost function and MS prevention. Dr. Marrie, coming back to you. In your view, how should we think about prevention?
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
Well, but as we start to think about how do we do this, so I think examples in other fields tell us that you really need to be organized about this to get your maximum impact as quickly as you can. And so when I'm thinking about prevention, I like to think about like the public health training about prevention that I was taught when I was earlier in my medical training and younger than I am now. So we can think about primary prevention. So that's going to be dealing with risk factors that people might have for multiple sclerosis. So been hearing Marc talk about his really fascinating EBV work, and the possibility that maybe we could target EBV with a vaccine. And so maybe somebody exposed to EBV wouldn't go on to develop MS. or somebody with, say, obesity or low vitamin D levels. We might be able to address those to reduce somebody's risk. So that would be our primary prevention concept. You can also think about secondary prevention, where the disease has started, but at a stage where it's really before we're seeing typical symptoms of that disease. So if we could find people where their biology has changed, so the immune system, as Marc has been describing to us, is misbehaving, but has not yet gotten to the point that people are having symptoms like fatigue or difficulty with their memory or episodes of vision loss, then if we could find them then, we might be able to prevent people from going on to what we currently recognize as MS. So I would think of that as secondary prevention. And then if we think about what we've been hearing about remyelination and repair and halting progression, that's kind of the tertiary prevention aspect of life. So you've got the disease, but once we identify it, at whatever point you come in the door, we want to halt things from going any further. And so that's kind of the framework that I like to apply so that we can organize ourselves so that we're not all working on the same piece of the pie all the time, and that we can actually try and fill in all the pieces that we need for a comprehensive framework.
Well said. Thank you. As a follow-up question, apart from EBV, what are some encouraging research developments over the last few years that suggest prevention is possible?
Thanks. So I think, we've been talking a lot about primary prevention, but I think the work in what I would say falls into the secondary prevention area is a particular interest to me. So if you think about people, for instance, who may have migraine headaches, some of them will tell you they know a migraine's coming because they feel thirsty or cranky or have a change in appetite a few hours or a day before they get that headache. In some other chronic disease like Parkinson's disease, we know that there's a similar warning phase where people may have problems with constipation and other things up to 20 years before. We didn't used to think that there was this early under the surface warning period for multiple sclerosis, but we now have some evidence to suggest that's the case. So we have seen that people with MS tend to start using more healthcare services for 5 or 10 or more years before they have a first typical symptom of multiple sclerosis. And there are some blood markers of injury to the brain that we refer to as serum neurofilament light chain would appear to rise before people have those typical symptoms. And so that gives us the idea that if we could find those individuals, we might be able to intervene then to stop progression. And a hint that we might be successful with that are some clinical trials in groups of individuals that we refer to as having a condition called radiologically isolated syndrome. So these are individuals who for some reason get a brain MRI. Often it's because somebody's having headaches or say they were in a car accident. So you get a brain imaging as part of making sure there was no injury. And they look like they have typical imaging findings of multiple sclerosis. But when you examine them, the examination is normal. You ask about symptoms, the individual feels well. And so there have now been a couple of clinical trials actually taking people with radiologically isolated syndrome, since these individuals turn out to be at increased risk of going on to MS in the future, showing that if you treat them with disease-modifying therapies we currently use for people with MS, we can dramatically, like 80%, sort of in one of the trials, we reduced by 80% the risk of going on to those MS symptoms, at least over a couple of years. And so that suggests maybe if we could find people in that prodromal phase, we might have the opportunity to prevent people from moving on to presenting with MS, or at the very least delaying it so people could get on with doing the things they want to do in life for longer before they have to face MS.
Thank you. Thank you. One more follow-up question for you. How can global organizations like MS Canada work together to advance research in MS prevention?
Well, I think that working together is really key. MS Canada has been a really important contributor to an effort called the International Progressive MS Alliance, where people have really been trying to come together to organize work around dealing with that unmet treatment need for progressive MS. And so I think we need a similar kind of strategy for prevention, which means we need to know what everybody's working on. We need to figure out what the holes are that we need to fill in from a knowledge perspective. And we really need to think about who's doing the work that's most relevant to filling those holes and making sure that that gets supported and that the information is shared with the people who are working on the other pieces of that pie so that we can really translate it and move it quickly. And then I think, we need to engage the people who are likely to be delivering those preventive interventions, like family care docs and the community and public health agencies, to make sure they know what we're doing. So when we have the strategies for prevention, they're like, okay, we've got it. You've given us all the information we need. Absolutely, we want to help you make those accessible to people around the world who are at risk.
Thank you. That's great. And I'm glad this is recorded, because those are good building blocks for our to think about for our prevention work going forward. So thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Horwitz, coming to you. What is your perspective on MS prevention?
Well, as a virologist from training, obviously a vaccine would be a wonderful thing. The virus is something that we've evolved with for thousands of years. And so the negative on a vaccine here might be maybe we need it for something, but to date, all we seem to need it for is autoimmune disease and cancer and maybe some other chronic diseases. So I think it's time to really consider getting rid of it. And I think it would be best for everyone. On the other hand, that will only help people that are going to go on to get MS at some point in their life, and that's a minority of people compared to vaccinating for the flu or something like that. One of the stronger supporting arguments for why this would potentially really work is that even with the COVID vaccine, we're not seeing a dramatic change in virus transmission. Virus is still transmitted, people still get sick, but people don't get long COVID as well, or the more chronic parts of the disease. So severe disease has been stopped by vaccines for years. And really, that's the outcome that we need to think about as we think back on vaccines. They've kept people out of the hospital, and they've kept people from dying and stopped severe disease. So in terms of EBV, MS, and other autoimmune diseases that it affects fit right into that, as well as cancer. But that does only affect the people that at the start that haven't had the disease yet. And as Ruth has said, we really need to work on people at the stage of RIS. So we need something in the prodromal area that we can look at and identify these people better and give them some treatment. And I think that is a place where we need a lot more activity. I know that for us, we have these mice that we can take people's blood and look at them and see what that immune response looks like. Is it in a detente with the virus that could lead to future issues? And have some of those things already started, because we can see differences in our mice. So that's one way to go. But it would be also nice to have a vaccine that worked on people that actually have some MS starting in their body, because. And since I actually work on a lot of different autoimmune diseases, I see that in diabetes, we seem to be luckily a little bit farther along, because we can tell people in their prodromal state by the antibodies levels of autoantibodies and things like that. So a lot of work is now going on vaccines that can kind of get in there, maybe even after the virus has done a little bit of its damage in that case. And so I've been looking at trying to see what kinds of things we could model for MS in that regard as well. But I think in the end, I think vaccines are our best hope for prevention, or to be able to change our immune system, modulate it as soon as we can, which is what some of these treatments are doing in RIS.
Thank you. That's great. Dr. Voronova, coming to you. With your focus on repair and regenerative strategies, what does prevention look like to you?
So I'll circle all the way back and just remind that prevention is also halting the disease progression, or preventing some of the more debilitating symptoms, especially in people with progressive MS. And so I view my work fitting in that second and third stage. So just as an overall overview of current pro-regenerative therapies development around the world, is that there are mainly 3 different strategies. So one is you can offer protection for those nerves that I've said they kind of die off or damage. You can reduce inflammatory environment around these nerves. We determine that as neuroinflammation. And the last bit is that you replace the cells that were lost. So the nerve cells, as well as these oligodendrocytes. So I think that oligodendrocytes were mentioned at least once today. So these are the cells that produce that myelin. And so people around the world are tackling all three strategies to offer regeneration. And so coincidentally, fractalkine seems to be a molecule that offers all three of those. And so through our research, we've actually realized that it's not just important to engage stem cells, but it's also important to modulate inflammation at the same time. And so we've now begun to think how we need to offer sort of this multimodal modulation of different cell types in the brain to really achieve the best health outcome. And so with that, I said that I see myself fitting into the second and third stage. I think that neuroprotection is great. And that, of course, relies on our ability to predict MS. And so there is a lot of people working in that area. But we also importantly shouldn't forget about people who already have MS symptoms, especially people with progressive MS. And so I hope that our research offers some hope in that regard, and that I hope that we're going to come up with different strategies, but also for people who already are experiencing symptoms, and that we can still hold their disease progression. And if we're lucky, maybe we can even reverse some of the neurological symptoms that these people may experience.
Thank you. That's wonderful to hear, and thank you all for the thoroughness of your answers to these really important questions. I really appreciate it. The MS research community's momentum around the many aspects of MS prevention really demonstrates the diversity of research that's required to not only address current challenges we are facing, but to also follow where the science is leading us into the future. As we've heard today, this is an exciting time in MS research, as we're on the cusp of some promising advancements that will change the lives of people affected by MS, not just here in Canada, but around the world. So I hope as people were listening that they've started to think about some questions to ask this wonderful group of panelists. I certainly want to thank, as we move into the Q&A segment, I certainly want to thank our panelists for sharing their wealth of knowledge with us today. What we've heard reflects some of the tremendous progress made towards MS Canada's impact goals and gave us insight to where the future advancements will be made. We'll now move to our guest-led question and answer. There was a lot of information we just covered, so I'm sure there are some questions from our guests. Please enter your question into the Q&A chat, and we'll do our best to have all your questions answered. Of course, please note that questions pertaining to specific personal situations, whether health or medical related, cannot be answered in this type of venue. And we recommend contacting your MS healthcare providers or the MS Knowledge Network to address these questions. So while we wait for questions to come in from our guests, I'll ask a general question to our panel. What do you view as the greatest challenges in MS that we can address through research? And how is MS Canada important to achieving this goal? And I know some of this has been answered already, but I would like to hear from you on this one as well. So again, what do you view as the greatest challenges in MS that we can address through research? And how is MS Canada important to achieving this goal? Maybe Dr. Marrie, I'll come to you first. That's okay?
Sure. So I think we've really touched on them. I mean, from my perspective, I think we would love to be able to tell people who have MS that their children and friends and family will never have to face that possibility because we've come up with a way to completely prevent MS. I think for anyone who has started down that MS journey, I think we would really like to be able to halt that. And for those who are already struggling with a high burden of symptoms and limitations in their lives, I think we would like to be able to rewind that with remyelination and repair. That's a lot of things, and there are many things attached to that, all the other impacts in the background that happen when people are in that journey. So I think MS Canada plays an enormous role. Partly, they fund the work of all of us here. There are other funders? Yes, there are federal funders, but we're competing with researchers talking about diabetes and Alzheimer's disease and other kinds of things. So It can be very hard to get those dollars. So MS Canada plays an enormous role in helping to find funding so we can actually answer these questions. There's also really an enormous role from an advocacy standpoint. So research dollars in general are hard to come by. And so organizations like MS Canada are going to need to really remind the world that we are not going to answer these questions unless somebody provides resources to do it. And that this is a really important disease from a Canadian perspective. And then I think the other piece is bringing everybody together. So people who work all by themselves do not make as much progress as people who have the opportunity to collaborate and work with others. And so we're really fortunate that MS Canada every 3 years brings researchers like us together into one room. So this is how we meet with people and come up with like new ideas of things that we're going to work on and discover connections in areas that maybe aren't the ones that we spend all of our time in. And those are really, really important catalysts for novel ideas. And I think that's an important part of the reason that Canada has been recognized for punching above its weight in terms of, little population relative to contributions to MS research.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marrie. A couple of questions have started to roll in, so I'll go to those now. First one is for Dr. Horwitz. Can you explain why EBV, like what's particular about EBV and not other viruses? Is there a way to delineate or describe the difference between the two?
Well, yeah. So I think that what EBV is doing is the one thing is it's staying chronic or latent within us. And so it's changed how our immune system is going to respond to something. Now, there's other viruses that do that, like herpes and chickenpox, but they stay latent in neurons. There's CMV, HHE6, 7. They can be in our immune cells as well. But one of the problems that EBV faces, because it's chosen this B cell to stay in, is that B cells turn over every time you decide to make an antibody to something or your body has to do something. That means that cell is going to turn over and die or run amok or do whatever, but the virus needs to move on. It has to move to another B cell or maybe to another person to stay alive forever. And so in doing that, that's part of what is happening when it's manipulating our immune system. So it isn't necessarily the action, it's just the thought that it has to do this. So it has to have feelers out or kind of spy molecules on our immune system, and our immune system has to spy on the virus as well. So they really know what's happening, and how that relates to MS is really important. Now, another virus, cytomegalovirus, has been implicated in other diseases for similar ways, and it hides in macrophages and other immune cells. So these interconnections are really important to understand. We don't commonly think about it, but a lot of other viruses now, like even COVID, are thought to have a latent or chronic stage where they're in small amount wherever they're hiding in our body long term. And so those things are having consequences in other diseases. And I think since B cells are a major component, as we know from the therapies that seem to have some effect on MS, that this is an important target, and it's just aligned right. And that's why EBV has such a strong relationship.
Thank you for explaining that. Next, I'm going to come to you, Dr. Marrie. Is there anything parents with MS can do to help prevent their children from getting MS?
So that's often a question we get. So I think that the first thing to know is what's the general risk that your kids are facing. So it is higher than for people without MS, but it's going to be about 3 to 5%. A little lower if you have a boy, and a little higher if you have a girl. So broadly, the things that we would think about are based really on the risk factors that we know about. So we know that exposure to cigarette smoke can increase risk, whether you're smoking yourself or whether your kids are exposed to secondhand smoke. So that would be something that you could do from a prevention standpoint. We know that obesity, particularly for girls in childhood, increases the risk of MS. And so having kids who not obsessed about weight, but have a healthy diet, are active and sort of maintain the healthy weight, that Health Canada would recommend, would be reasonable to think about. And then MS Canada has some guidelines about vitamin D for people who are interested in thinking about that from a primary prevention standpoint, where we just talk about making sure your children get what Health Canada recommends as sort of regular dosing for that. So those would all be sort of standard things that we could think about until we have more specific guidance around targeted things, that if we knew that you had MS and there was a vaccine, that maybe it would be worth thinking about.
Thank you. Very helpful. Dr. Voronova, I'm going to come to you next. How close is myelin repair research ready for human trials?
So I am not a neurologist, so this is a very important thing to understand. But we work with a lot of neurologists to anticipate how we're going to design the clinical trials. So there are a few clinical trials already on the way. So one of them is with clemastine. You might have heard about it. It's an antihistamine drug. The other is metformin, which is a very common diabetes drug. So these are ways to pharmacologically engage the stem cells we have in our brain for myelin repair. And there's also another way to think about it, where people have thought that perhaps we can transplant stem cell derived cells into the brain and repair it this way. So there's a clinical trial going on that's led by Dr. Stephen Goldman. So you can hear from me that these are still trials. So they're not quite ready for clinical applications. So I think that the fact that we are running these clinical trials is a very good step in a positive direction, but of course we're not there quite yet. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to also put sort of a timeline on something so important as well. But a lot of researchers around the world are working individually as well as together on tackling these. And so it certainly gives me a great hope that we're going to get there.
Wonderful, promising. Thank you. Dr. Marrie, coming back to you. You'll like this one, I think. Is there a way, so if there is to be a focus on early detection, how do we make the diagnostic process easier and faster?
So that's actually specifically something we've been discussing as we've been thinking about sort of that prodromal phase. So there are a couple of things. So we have recently just been working on revising our diagnostic criteria again to try and allow us to, for somebody who's presenting with typical symptoms, make that diagnosis faster with fewer MRIs and less testing, but still being confident about the diagnosis. But if we step back a little bit further to that prodromal phase where people aren't yet having typical symptoms, in the ideal world, we would want a way to figure out who needed the more detailed testing and who didn't. So one of the things that we have talked about is whether there are things like blood markers that would allow you, if somebody came in with non-specific symptoms or really unusual fatigue with no other cause, to get a test that might say, oh, this is abnormal. We don't know if it's MS, but it suggests there's something going on in the brain. It makes sense for you to get an MRI. And now we have a good case for getting that done faster versus, you know what, this is normal. It seems unlikely. We've also talked about the question of whether there are some researchers working on really rapid screening MRIs that are, 5 or 10 minutes, where, again, enough to get an idea of whether somebody needs that more detailed scan. So there is some work going on to try and figure out how we could accelerate things if we want to do that early detection, because you can imagine what would happen if we wanted to do testing for every single person who might have warning symptoms, knowing that there's really only a small group of them who are actually going to turn out to have MS. So this is a top of mind in terms of things that we would need to figure out to operationalize this.
Very good. Thank you. I'm going to come back to a question that I've already posed to you, Dr. Marrie, but I'm going to come to you, Marc, Dr. Horwitz. What do you view as the critical challenges in MS that we can address through research, and how is MS Canada important to achieving this goal?
Well, I think, well, I'll just say MS Canada is doing a great job. I mean, we're keeping people together, and we're getting us organized in terms of collaborations, training. We have, and we're supplying money, as Ruth had a great answer. So MS Canada is doing all the things that it needs to do. What it needs to do is more. I think just if we had more money, if we had more ways to get us all organized for collaborations, I think that would, instead of meeting every 3 years, let's meet every year. But all that costs money, and um, I think that's why we're punching above our weight, and that's why we have such a collegial group of PIs and researchers across Canada who all want to work together for the goal of doing something here for MS patients and future MS patients. So I think that's great. As far as what we need in terms of the biggest challenges, the disease is complicated. And I think we're all trying to figure out different aspects of it, and it's a moving target. Now we believe that EBVs absolutely were involved, but there's still another environmental effect, and Ruth named quite a few. And which ones are more likely? What are now the genetic variations? I mean, it's just getting more and more complicated. But the answer to how do we treat people and get better and all that has been the simple approaches, at least get rid of B cells, maybe get rid of the virus. All these things add up. But it's working as a team here has been great. And I think I just say, let's keep doing this and do more.
Well said. Well said. Absolutely a very collaborative group across the country and around the world. It's awesome. I'm going to bring the same question to you, Dr. Voronova, if that's okay. And I'll repeat it just in case you need that. So what do you view as the critical challenges in MS? And how is MS Canada important to achieving this goal?
Yeah, so maybe I'll try to encapsulate so many already great answers given by Dr. Marrie and Dr. Horwitz. Is I think that the next grand challenge is really to understand MS heterogeneity. Every time I meet with someone who has MS, they tell me that their MS is different than MS from somebody else who may be experiencing this disease. And so I think that by lumping everyone into the same group, we're probably missing out on a lot of different strategies, how we can prevent the disease or prevent the disease progression in that specific population. For that, of course, we need to understand how the disease, first of all, what's the onset of it? How does it progress? All the research that we're already doing. But I think it's going to be really important to understand how to best help that specific population of people who have MS, who may be unified by a particular, I don't know, inflammatory response or a lesion or a response, how they may respond to a drug, for example. And so that's something that it's very topical for me. I always think about, so what if we have a drug? How are we going to design that clinical trial? And do we have the means to track the progression of the disease? Do we have the means to track restoration of some of the neurological function faster than, for example, an EDSS or this Enhanced Disability Scale score, something that will give meaningful results in the least amount of time, and to really understand the individual basis for that disease heterogeneity. Why are we so different? And if we're treating everyone the same with the same drug, we're really expecting everyone to respond the same way to the drug, or are they going to respond differently? And I think someone had a question here that I'll try to lump in here. What if somebody has a very extensive myelin damage versus very little myelin damage? So we actually don't know the answers to these questions. We don't yet know when to intervene based on somebody's disease. And so these are all the things that we're doing, including my own lab. We're asking how to intervene, when to intervene based on whether it's severe disease or a milder form of the disease, and what's really the molecular basis of the response. In other words, if there is a drug that can't benefit everyone who has MS, maybe we can tease apart some kind of molecular basis who it will help, and then target that drug to that population and start developing another one. So that's kind of the research philosophy that occupies a lot of my brain at the moment. And I hope that at least some of this is going to be useful and maybe even adapted by the clinic, years down the road.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you so much. And as a moderator, I do have to pay attention to the time. I would love to keep this conversation going, but I do have to wind it down now. But thank you so much for your answers to those questions. And thank you for, all the great questions that were provided. It's great that people have engaged today in this opportunity. So I'd like to thank our panelists for taking time out of their very busy schedules, as you can gather from what they're up to, very busy, to be here with us, and for their continued work on the most challenging questions pertaining to MS. Thank you to everyone who joined the call today. We hope you enjoyed this amazing opportunity to hear about our panelists' work and the strides they are making in MS research. So to close off today's event, I will turn it back over to Jennifer Conley, my colleague and wonderful Vice President of Philanthropy at MS Canada, to say a few words. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ben, and bravo to you for moderating an extraordinary conversation with our incredible researchers. Just what a fascinating discussion, giving us deeper insights into the extraordinary research. And just from a personal perspective, I want to express my appreciation for how accessible you made your research for us today. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to join our webinar today. It's proof positive of our shared commitment to advancing our knowledge and our understanding of MS. We're so fortunate that Canada is a leader in MS research, and that's because of the support of the MS community right here. Your generosity is what enables Canadian researchers like our amazing panelists that you just heard from to contribute their work to growing the knowledge that's driving research breakthroughs. So in whatever way you choose to continue to support the MS community through fundraising, donations, or giving of your time and talents, every action contributes to the critical work being done to support discoveries, improve treatments, and fuel innovation within the MS research community. So in addition to me referring to you as champions and ambassadors, I'll also share that you are treasured catalysts. Every action you take is helping to improve the quality of life for Canadians affected by MS today and tomorrow. So as we close today's webinar, I invite you to stay connected with our MS community and to consider how else you might contribute to building a brighter future for everyone affected by this disease. I think it was Dr. Horwitz who said, we just need to do more. There's such power and such beauty in our individual and collective action. Your support, your passion, your voice as champions, ambassadors, and yes, as catalysts are vital to fulfill our shared vision of a world free of MS. Because we're not just imagining a better future together, we're building it together. Thank you so much. Wishing you just a wonderful day.